thank the Kini Academy to inviting me to uh, have discussions with the class. That I'm very pleased to. Although I'm currently not an academic or maybe a scholar in track 2, but I'm really enjoying, the pleasure and the chance to talk about the topic I have done so much research on. So before the beginning, I would like to have a kind request that the session is mostly the information sharing for the education purposes. So it's mostly reflect my own views. It's not my government. So if you want to quote me, so please seek my consent on that. Anything that because I may say something stupid. And I would like to start with, I would like to thank the 3 previous speakers who that lay setting the scene and lay the background for my topic to work on with the specific case of Vietnam and how Vietnam to deal with the security, maritime security in the South China Sea. I have my full slide and I already sent to the organizers of the class, and I'm very happy to share across the class. And if you have any questions, just let me know. And before I want to put something in perspective, because why the South China Sea and Vietnam have been spotlighted, in the national media. I have to emphasize that before 2009, the South China Sea and Vietnam is not a topical issue, to be frank. So basically, there was the coverage of the South China Sea disputes, or occasionally, there sometimes the tensions fan up and it's go down, but it's not have the lasting effects at the moment. But of course, before 2009, mostly we don't see much the incident in the South China Sea. But since 2009, more and more incidents. That the first thing. But the people interested more about China. So for the most 2000s, the basic questions about China is whether China rise peacefully or violently. And basically, the key argument is that China is rising or maybe developed in a peaceful manner. But I think that 2009, there are also the 2 very important development. The first one is that Vietnam and Malaysia jointly submitted the report on the boundary of the extended continental shelves on the UN Commissions on the limits of the continental shelf that provoked China to publish the 9-line map. And the second one also very important, that Vietnam after a long time after the war become spotlighted again, because Vietnam is published that Vietnam seek a deal about 6 kilo submarines that amounting to about $2 billion with Russia. So the question to the public is that why that small and impoverished country striking for development spend so much money on that type of submarines. That are very important. 2010, we also have another actor jump into space. We have the U.S. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton in Hanoi, and saying that that the U.S. have the national interest in the South China Sea. Of course, if you see when the USA, where the international media, and definitely Jiang Jiechi at that time at the front ministers of China in the middle of the conference room with the ASAN regional forum, stare at George, the Singaporean foreign minister, and say that China is a big country, other countries are small, and it just fight. Was he respond when other countries raise the South China Sea issue, was in front of the US, also other big powers, and China doesn't like it. And of course, subsequent decade, we see that the constant increasing tension in the South China Sea, and people care about, you know, what the ASAN did in the bunch of small fish, how they can counter the big fish, and whether they can foster consensus or not. And was it very a lot of story about that. And it comes up to, you know, because people talk about, as also mentioned, Dr. Doody talk about, you know, people question now the law, whether the changing order, the trend, the people talking about, you know, the rules-based order, freedom navigation, all the rules that happen. Of course, I'm talking about, you know, the plight of the fishermen in the rivalry, in the, you know, the disputes, so that they are depriving of some basic, you know, things. And of course, come up with the great power rivalry, and now with the nuclear power submarines, that the AUKUS agreement that Andy already mentioned. So I think that basically I just put things in the context you would understand. But of course, for Vietnam, it's very interesting case that the people care about, you know, how Vietnam responds to China rise, how Vietnam stood up, you know, against, you know, what is the coercive measure, the assertive. We see the pictures, the story of David, you know, versus Goliath, and we see how Vietnam worked with the ASEAN country, whether the ASEAN is united or divided, what's wrong with the Vietnam play over there. And of course, you know, that a lot of coverage about whether Vietnam warmed up relations with other powers to balance the China powers, and how the policy option for Vietnam with the China rise between the rock and hard place, and politics a small power strategy is a way the struggle for power. Of course, definitely, if you one of the book if important about the South China Sea is Robert Kaplan about the boiling cauldron, because he said that, you know, the fate of the South China Sea hanged up on Vietnam. Of course, you look in history, Vietnam, one of the country has stood up against China many times. And of course, we have a lot of coverage about, you know, the dispute of fishermen and fishing community. And that basically we have a lot of narratives and stories about the South China Sea. Usually the media interested in sex shop or maybe scenes or whatever. But now, you know, with the tension rising up in the South China Sea, it considers at the, what is that, the phone lines of the new order that will draw a lot of attention from media, also the scholars as well. So basically, why Vietnam and so South China have been very topical issue for research and also international media. And basically, back to, of course, no, I will not cover all the things I mentioned in my slides, and feel free to ask questions and you want, but I will go through very quickly. And how the South China Sea perceived international Vietnam national security, what are claims and the dispute, what Vietnam misperceive, what are the key challenges and how Vietnam responds to the challenges. I will focus on what is the distinctive features about Vietnam as compared to other claimants in other countries. So I think that it's important to make a case about Vietnam, in that how the case of Vietnam has been, had drawn a lot of attention from international media, because, you know, it's a key players in that things, and it's one a small player but important role, but it signifies also trend of the alignment or realignment in the regional politics. So that's the reason why we have the story to cover. And of course, I bet that, you know, you also will do a lot of things about it, and then how to think about to frame your story into different type of frames that already exist. Now, basically, how has Vietnam viewed the EC? Of course, in Vietnam, the Vietnamese people call it the EC. And of course, the Philippines call the West Philippine Sea. And of course, China called the South Sea. But of course, internationally referred as the South China Sea as an international name, but also disputes, controversies among the claimants, also the party involved. But compared to Vietnam, it definitely, if you look into the history, the Vietnamese, but the parasounds partly as a part of the national patrimony, because, you know, they have the evidence to prove, you know, the dynastic empires have to connect to these two islands group, you know, from at least the 17th century. They also have to send the people regularly, and also the French into China. Of course, when Vietnam is colonized by France, they also raised a claim and also took the claim and also occupy this. And of course, they argue that the Chinese only came very, very late in 1909. So they don't even have the distinction between the paracel and Spratlys. And of course, they also argue that the China unlawful use of force in 1974 and 1988 is illegal. So that will not bring the Chinese the legitimate title over the things. Of course, there's also argument about, the involvement of the Philippines and Malaysia is quite late. Mostly in the 1970s and 1980s. So basically what the Vietnamese perceive over, the sea and also the territories over there. But I think that is more important for Vietnam to actually see the sea and islands at the security buffer and the link. Because if you look into the geopolitics of Vietnam, you see that it's really, the country, the S-shaped, elongated territory, quite vulnerable to the seaborne attacks. And most of the invasion in the modern history to Vietnam mostly from the sea. That's the reason why the islands is considered as a critical outpost for the national security. And of course, the maritime zone is a part of the security for the country. And if you look into even the terrain, so the terrain of Vietnam is, you look into the middle of the Vietnam, so it's only 50 kilometers. I think it's very short and very vulnerable to the sea. And also it is separated by navigable waters. So in the past, Vietnam were invaded mostly through the sea and through the rivers. That's the reason why, Vietnam, they see that from the strategic point of view, they call that it's lacks of strategic depth. It means that if you face an attack from the foreign invaders, you don't have much space you don't have much rears, to withdraw and also to fight. So that's the reason why that the French also, they have some logical idea, that when they occupy Vietnam, also they occupy Cambodia and Laos, because, that will increase the strategic depth. But for Vietnam, so because of modern Vietnam is that so. So basically, that gives the reasons that Vietnam consider the corridor, the sea corridor along the coastline is very important for security. So of course, it's a pool of resources, but I encourage you to look into that, but mostly the hydrocarbon and fish is very important for the national development. So I think that other speaker already mentioned that definitely is very important for Vietnam economies. Increasingly, Vietnam become a trading nations. That modern day now Vietnam trade is about 200% of GDP. Is only behind Singapore, but Singapore is really small, so it doesn't count. So Vietnam is one of the the most open economy in the region, in the world. So that, the seaborne trade is very important for Vietnam, but for the regions as well. I have a footnote here is that still now we have a lot of air links and a lot of road links, but 90% of the trade in the world is remains seaborne. So that reason why that the sea and ocean are very important, the most important medium for the transportations, especially energy from the Middle East to East Asia. Also, that comes up to how the busy sea lane, because you see the pictures of from Andy and also other people. So I don't mention this again. And fast forward, of course, there's a lot of that definition, perception. Of course, the media lie to the idea, how Vietnam be surrounded, and how the living space and also the liberalism that is very constrained, by the expanding Chinese influence. Because it's whether or not Vietnam is landlocked, a sea-locked country, and of course it's very attractive to the media and how to portray, Chinese expression in the seas and also the influence in the regions and the way that to cover up. Of course, it have some logical because the China's and Cambodia, the Khmer collusion before to create a lot of problems for Vietnam, because from Vietnam to invade to what is that to interfere into Cambodia, and that definitely a lot of the debate on that. Of course, Vietnam argued that it's a legitimate wars because they have eliminated the genocide regime of Khmer Rouge. But of course, other countries may have the different interpretations and of that. But that I had to bring the memory back, and now go back to the South, the claims and the disputes. But Dr. Dudi also mentioned that we have different type of claims. Of course, first one, but definitely with the sovereignty, but the Spratly and the Paracels. And if you look into the Paracels, we see the weaving, the fabric of occupation is very complex and mixed. And basically, of course, that already mentioned. So we have the sovereignty disputes of the Paracel, the Spratly, of course, the Scarborough Shoal. We have the dispute of the maritime boundaries and jurisdictions, of course, with different maritime entitlements, overlapping zone, and of course, the dispute over the legal status of the China U-shaped claim that many times that the China interpreted as a historic rise. We also have the different interpretations of UNCLOS, especially the legal features of the Paracel and Spratly, the validity of the archipelagic baseline that the China apply around the Paracel Islands. Of course, we're also talking about the freedom of navigation and overflight that Dr. Dudi also mentions, that some country consider the other country military exercise in EEZ, other coastal states are illegal, but others would think differently. So the both think that the legal landscape seems to be very complex in this. And of course, that encourage you to look into the UNCLOS. And of course, what it consider that the constitution of the ocean and the sea, I won't go there. But of course, the much controversies about the China claim, the 9-9 claim, which account for about 60 to 80% of the South China Sea, that many people believe that is goes against UNCLOS. Of course, I have the share map maybe with the Dr. Dudi, but of course you see that how China mix up the sovereignty dispute of the maritime claims. And so if you think that if China argument, if every features have the 200 nautical mile of EEZ and continental shelf, and we'll see a very complex pictures, legal landscape over that. But of course, after thanks to the tribunal ruling, so we see that it's very easy now. If you see the second pictures, you see that much of the claims to the features now just go back to about 12 nautical mile of the territorial seas, or maybe even the low tide elevation cannot have that territorial sea. So the disputed areas had been reduced to the minimum. Of course, if China complied to the tribunal ruling, or also complied to the UNCLOS, so we have. Well, I think the South China's dispute are not a big issue at the moment. But of course, China still have very, very weird interpretations of UNCLOS and also the historic rights that lead to the most of the conflicts and the problems we have today. The problem for Vietnam that, isn't have the legitimate claims, whether they have the power to defend that. Of course, the same thing apply maybe to other countries, if you have the claim, but do you have insufficient power to stand up and to counter the assertive actions and claims by other claimants? So that leads to very complex situation there. So Vietnam foreign policies, I have also put the South China Sea. Of course, normally no country want to have a bad relation with China, with the big power, and so with United States, anything. The small and medium-sized country, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course, the Singapore, Cambodia, they don't want to mess up with the big powers. What they want to peace, stability, and productive relationship, working relationship with neighbors and big power. But of course, they also want to stand to defend their sovereignty and legitimate interests. Because sometimes, these two goals are going together, but most of the time they did not go together. So because if you don't have enough sufficient power to defend your sovereignty, because you may have some type of, unequal type of relationship, or maybe you have to compromise some other interests. But for Vietnam, I mean, one of the ways that Vietnam stand down among the peers, among the Southeast Asian country, because they quite skillfully to manage to secure the dual foreign policy goals for a sufficient time. Because the Vietnamese approach is still maintain the sovereignty of the parcel and Spratly, even though the parcel is already fully occupied by the Chinese. Because they call for the respect for UNCLOS, and of course call on the maritime claims to be aligned with UNCLOS text and spirits. Because they advocate for no threat or use of force or peaceful means under the UN Charter and UNCLOS, have the right mechanism to different type dispute, and also to comply with other instruments like contract use and DOC. Was usually that the common lines okay, that more or less the same with the Southeast Asian claimant, except the claim over the Paracel and Spratly. But Vietnam, like other countries, also sent a couple of non-verbal United Nations to circulate their positions. And I think I would like to draw your attention to that non-verbal battle in United Nations that that involve dozens of countries, even involve the external powers like US, Australian, Japan, 3 European countries that also speak out, stand up, and speak out against the Chinese unlawful claim in the sea. So of course also Vietnam rely on ASAN also medium to work with China. So of course working the most important at the moment is to build up the code of conduct, because there are a lot of controversies and of course a lot of debates on the process. But of course many external powers don't want China's and ASEAN country to sit in a closed room and to set the rules for the region, and they want the set of rule. Any come down from the type of gathering have to respect and also comply with national law, and also with no prejudice to the rights and obligation of third countries. I go down because we see that Vietnam raise the issue with many countries because they think that the peace stability in the South China Sea is an international issue. It's not only for coastal state, and that's the reason why that they call for the applications of UNCLOS and the effort of the country to maintain peace and stability in the region. Key challenge, of course. Now, I'm being a little bit academic at the moment, to provide some analytical frameworks, because sometimes I forget myself at academic before, but we need to distinguish between threats and risks. If you call one country, call other country a threat, it means that that would be the possibility of war happen to them soon. So you need to make own the preparation for that. If it's just a risk, for so that what you deal with is mostly the risk management. So threat is combinations of the capability and the intent. If you have one country that have capability and also that also have the intention to invade you, so that is a problem. So that makes this country immediately a threat to other. And to cope with threat, one country have the only two options from the realist point of view. Either you balance against that or you bandwagon with that. So basically, come back some theory of the national relation for you. But the risk is combination of possibility, probability, and consequences. It means that it may happen, it may not happen, right? So you see that the risk of war. So it means that the war can happen and the war may not happen. Of course, the consequences could be low or maybe be high. It depends. So basically, I would argue that in the post-Cold War, even China become more have a very expensive claim and also become very assertive. But Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries don't consider China as threats. But it just consider them as a source of risks, because you also have multiple sources of risks if you talk about non-territorial security, and also mentioned by Dr. Dudi and also mentioned by Dr. Ashura Saleh at the beginning, because also natural disasters, also the problem to the navigation, the piracies, what is that, the armed criminals, any type of violence that would have, the sea level rise. It's the natural, and also it's also have the human factors as well. So if you talk about risks, so there's no chance that you can remove the whole risk. A threat you can have it limited by different ways, but risk is still over there. But of course, they have, but although it face no threats, but it has a range of risks, especially in terms of traditional securities. The risk of armed conflicts in the South China Sea very low in the previous decade, but it have been rising very quickly in 2010 and the subsequent decades, because we see the more frequencies of the clashes and also standoff at sea. We see involvement with different things. But recently we see with the crowd of the submarines in the South China Sea, the U.S. submarines bang into something that is not the unidentified object at the moment. So of course, it means that the possibility of wars, of armed conflict is increasing over the last decade, because that brings us to the subsequently how Vietnam cope with the riskier South China Sea, or the riskier ground in the South China Sea that may have seen. Right, because if you look into the history, you see that maybe you have to be aware that the armed conflict is not been eliminated. That at least and 3 occasions that the China use resort to arms to use the upper hand in the South China Sea to jump to move in the some reefs, occupy some reef from under the control of other state. Because you will see that. But of course, it leads to the literatures, how we perceive the China's approach to the South China Sea. That's great that Andy had already so mentioned about the gray zone operations. But of course, also other scholars also talk about the South China Sea is comparable to Russia, to Ukraine, and also other part of with it near abroad. It's been the hybrid warfare. It's mean that defined as a broad, complex, adaptive, and highly integrated combination of conventional and unconventional means, overt and covert activities by military, paramilitary, irregular civilian actors that targeted to achieve geopolitical and strategic objectives. So I mean that is that different time frame also for how the China operate in the South China Sea, and of course that encourage also media look into how China activities and claim in the South China Sea. I think it's a combination of different elements, but we see the coercive actor at sea, we see economic statecraft also apply, we see the diplomatic and political leveraging, and also through various kind of bilateral relation that at the expense of the ASAN grouping. And of course, we also see the propaganda and so perception battle. We also the legal warfare. I go very well quickly so that you can, from the media point of view, you can under very brief overview of what the people talk and analyze about the Chinese activities and actions over there. So that the people try to map out what happened in the South China Sea from the period 2009 until 2016. And you see that the increased number of frequencies about the clashes and standoff, and also how different type of incident happen, mostly involved with the Chinese elements, either the fishing, either the coast guard, either the Navy ship that happen across the South China Sea. Plus, we see different type of the literatures about the China tactic, about the cabbage, or maybe the salami slicing, the cabbage tactic. It's just some terms that will give you, some ideas about how the formation of ship have been, deployed in the sea. You see the warship involved. You see the coast guard cutters. China, the biggest coast guard cutter in the world. It's about 12,000 tons. it up at Munster. And of course, if you see other country Coast Guard come to that Coast Guard cutter, they see they very smooth and they don't have the scam. As we ask why the people invest so much money to do that big ship. And previously, China renovate, the warship into the Coast Guard to make, the warship into the civilian ship. That make, that ship also that type of different type of monster at sea. We also see the deployment of maritime militia, other type of economic activity like oil and survey vessels. And of course, over the last years, you see the Chinese survey vessels everywhere in the South China Sea, in Vietnamese economic zone, in the Malaysian, Indonesia, in Philippines, and also beyond the regions as well. And so the question is whether that type of activities illegal or lawful or unlawful, of course, how can you counter and also how to block it? Of course, because behind that survey vessel, so you also see maritime militia because that's cutter. What will you do? Behind the different type of formation that will give other countries very different choices. Now, of course, if you see, if you're interested in the strategic standpoint, when you see how many vessels China have, how many combatants, comparisons that China now become the biggest navy in the world, and it's bigger and all the Asian state combined, right? So how can you work with that? And if you see the Coast Guard, even the Coast Guard China have also dominate the sea. So it's just the number that could say you something. How if you put yourselves in the in Kuala Lumpur, yourselves in the government of Vietnam, Philippines, and Brunei, and Singapore, and Indonesia. So what can we do? I'm quite still surprised that Indonesia still consider they are not non-claimant to the South China Sea disputes. That's one way or another, but we see increasingly the Chinese survey vessels and fishing present near the Natuna Islands, and that create a lot of tension between the two countries. So become very quick. Of course, the China built up the very large scale artificial island in the middle of the sea. And if you think that is useless, so think again, because that kind of facilities give the China's more frequent at sea, and they can deploy the vessels permanently near Malaysia, near Vietnam, in the area of Vietnam, near the Philippines, because you see 24/7 the Chinese have vessels near the Luconia shore. That is just dozens of nautical miles from the Malaysian coast. So what is it? What does it mean? That the permanent presence over there. This means that how can you trace away and claim? So that a big issue to many countries. And of course, it's very interesting to see how Vietnam and the country respond to that. And of course, you see, it's interested to you from the strategic point of view, you see the range of the missile that would be deployed in those islands to see, how things that have been changed, the strategic landscapes have been different, from when China built up that type of basis in the middle of the sea. So of course, if you follow the ASAN, you have a lot of debate about ASAN, whether ASAN is success or a failure, whether ASAN unite or ASAN become a disarray under the Chinese pressure. We see how the China maneuvering between the different type of bilaterals to get the leverage, the press for joint development, the COC, the DOC, and also the different type of engagement with the major powers. We see, of course, economic instrument. We see how the China boycott, the bonanza from the Philippines, to stop the tourists, the flow of tourists to other countries. And could you see incentive from the Belt and Road Initiative? Because Philippines is another country that are quite disappointed, with the Chinese promise of the investment in the country under that scheme. Because not only the Philippines, but other countries, big Chinese project in Indonesia and Malaysia as well. So very interesting that it's not the only front, but you see that the propaganda, the information, the publicity become a front that you may or may not know. What the Chinese have the idea of three warfares. It's mean the public opinion, psychological warfare, and the legal warfare as well. And if you follow the South China Sea, it's very interesting, you know, how different type of source information that will provide you. For example, you know, so I don't talk about, you know, the perception. You can study itself, but of course it's good for the media to understand. But you are also part of the battle. You are also part of the information and legal warfare and also psychological warfare. And of course, you talk about what is that? The Thucydides chap, you know, how to inflame the Chinese nationalism, the netizen, 100 years of humiliations. It's all type of very, very interesting, you know, narratives that only shaped throughout the way. We'll talk about the way, a cycle of action reactions, and so China claim, and then the legal warfare, how, you know, historical anecdotes have been told, how, you know, the legal and counter arguments. And of course, you see that a lot of books have population that could, you know, provide medias a lot of people. And of course, I've become very famous because my topic and published a book about that to become of the debate. Because you know, you see the whole range of the publication to that. So no worries, you have a lot of literatures and scholarship to do, to study if you want to do. But of course, you know, China's become very smart, and they publish, they perhaps, you know, hired the scholar to publish a book in 1980s when nobody knows about the South China Sea, to talk about the historical evidence anecdotes. But of course, the people see that the China have a bank of all the things that, you know, the scholar can go on to go. That event very interesting was, you know, you see the SCSPI on the left, on the right, above right side. That also the initiative deployed by the University of Beijing to talk about, you know, different activities. And I'm political scientist, and one time that I become very familiar with, you know, all type of ship tracking, the marine traffic, and also what type of vessel fighters. Just because you want to find what is the issue, what is ship over there, how to do it, and you know, whole type of, you know, the propaganda warfares and stuff. You know, one day that the Chinese scholar came down with the idea that, you know, the hundred of Vietnamese fishing intruded into waters of Hainan. I was so surprised. I said that really Vietnam fishermen we have the bravery that, you know, they don't afraid, you know, how the Chinese, you know, perimeter defense that important. They also it's also the rumors that the Vietnam fishermen, you know, approach very clear to the submarine base in Sanya. Said that what? So what is the defensive measure you have in case, you know, even the fishing ship can penetrate that deeper? Because you see there are so many misinformation and many things that happen that will create, you know, the whole network of information, the cloud information about the South China Sea definitely is very rich. And of course, if you have the tribunal ruling, China school also published about 534 pages about how critical study of the tribunal awards. You know, which are the critical point by point by the tribunal ruling. And it's interesting that comes up different things and that the legal warfare I mentioned. And of course, you know, the network of the China, pro-China's newspaper, and also the network of the Chinese media across the world increasingly. And interesting for me at our discovery is that, you know, China put the 9-line map in all the scientific journals. So whenever, I mean, in the in the physics, in the geometry, in the naturals, in the, I mean, hard science, you see the China map with the 9-line. And of course, you know, I got, I think, 10,000 of them everywhere. And how that to shape, you know, the map, you know, the, what is that, the mental map, you know, of China. Of course, it comes to the movie, it comes to the Red Sea operation, it comes to what is a small kid, you know. So you think that it's spilled into the cinemas as well. And of course, you know, that is an idea. So how Vietnam cope with that is also really the most interesting that the media think whether Vietnam is accommodated to China or whether Vietnam stood up to China, whether Vietnam make a choice, you know, to allies with U.S. and other powers to cope with the rise of China, or whether Vietnam and China, so two communist countries, they work together. So That's the reason why that Vietnam is a way of very interesting story to media, and I hope that we can have a chance to look into the case. But the Vietnam behavior in the South China is also complex. What I call the multi-pronged hatching. So it is in that different contradicting elements within the policy. We have on the one hand, Vietnam engaged very deeply with other claimants, including China, to negotiate the settlement of the dispute, to negotiate the COC, to negotiate the DOC. It also involved in hard balancing with regarding to invest heavily to modernize its submarines and also on type of defensive measures. It also one of the country took a lead in building up the law enforcement, one of the sturdiest law enforcement unit within Southeast Asia, and also it engaged with other countries, especially major power, try to create a network of partnership. It have about 30 agreement of partnership with all the major power. So many people think that Vietnam is also one way another try to realign with other major power to work on that. Because it's quite controversies and many arguments from the scholarly point of view. But I think that Vietnam is pursued a very independent foreign policy in the way that it will try to avoid any side up with one country against another's, and it tries to separate things and work out in a very mature manner in a way to settle the dispute for the long-term interest, but also at the same time behave quite responsibly to any crises happen. Because Vietnam can do many things, but because so far I think that the Vietnam policy into that is quite sophisticated and complex. Because it work out gradually clarifying the claims and align it with the UNCLOS. And it's a long-standing settlement. You see that Vietnam has been the leader in settling the dispute with the neighbors. It have the first country have the maritime boundary with the China's in the Gulf of Tonkin, and currently negotiating with China's at the area of the Gulf of Tonkin. Simultaneously, also talk with Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia on delimiting different conflict for the overlapping areas. It also engaged in a lot of dispute management and conflict including measures with regular talks, with hotlines, and of course to discuss the DOC, COC, also the code, the code for the unplanned encounter SCs. So of course you see that it's a whole cooperative measures that already been put into place. It's the workshop conference, the joint scientific survey with Philippines, the joint survey with Philippines and China between 2005 to 2008, joint patrol with China in the Gulf of Tonkin, of course, portfolio joint activities, and of course, you build up quite quickly the maritime capabilities and building, and of course, it have also the network of the partnership with all the majors across the globe, and of course, engage a lot of proper crisis management, and of course, when the crisis happen, I have seen that Vietnam behave persistent but very patient. It stand very firm on the ground, but at the same time, it's not overreact to the Chinese activity. It keep open the communications. It it open up and speak very vocally, and of course, it try to manage the national sentiment so that the work is not stand out. So briefly, 4 points about Vietnam. That the issue of the South China Sea is very important national security problems for Vietnam in the post-Cold War. Vietnam see UNCLOS and the status quo as part of the rule-based order as a critical interest. Of course, the risks of the traditional security of the conflicts are long-term, comprehensive, and increasingly complex. And Vietnam response to that is central upon multi-pronged risk management that will help the country defend its own interests at the same time to maintain the working relationship with all neighbors. So thank you very much, and hope that I could clear some questions and things about the Vietnam as a case study about this maritime security in the South China Sea, also beyond. Thanks a lot.